Margaret looked around the crowded community center and sighed quietly. The monthly social gathering was in full swing, but she felt invisible. At 42, she had watched the same scene play out for years. Young women in their 20s chatted and laughed with men who barely glanced in her direction. She smoothed down her simple blue dress and tried to look interested in the conversations around her. But the truth was hard to ignore. In this small farming town, women were expected to marry young and start families right away. By the time you reached your 40s without children, people whispered that you were past your prime. Margaret had heard those whispers plenty of times. She worked as the town's only librarian, a job she loved dearly. Every day she helped children find their favorite books and guided teenagers through research projects. She organized reading clubs for elderly residents and made sure everyone felt welcome in her little library. Her co-workers often said she had the biggest heart in town, but none of that seemed to matter when it came to finding love. She watched as Tom, a divorced man about her age, laughed with Jenny, a 25-year-old teacher. Jenny was sweet and kind, but Margaret couldn't help feeling a pang of sadness. Tom had asked Margaret about library hours just last week, and she had hoped he might be interested in getting to know her better. Now she realized he was probably just being polite. The older women in town often told Margaret she was too picky or that she should lower her standards, but Margaret didn't think wanting genuine connection and kindness was asking too much. She had dated a few men over the years, but they all seemed to be looking for something she couldn't provide. Either they wanted children right away, or they were comparing her to their memories of younger women. Margaret's sister Linda often called from the city, trying to convince her to move away and start fresh. "There are plenty of men in their 40s here who would appreciate a woman like you," Linda would say. But Margaret loved her small town. She loved her job and the community she had helped build around the library. This was her home, even if it sometimes felt lonely. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself standing alone by the refreshment table. She picked up a small sandwich and tried to look busy, but inside she felt that familiar ache of being overlooked. She was educated, financially stable, and had so much love to give. Yet in a room full of people, she felt completely alone. Mrs. Patterson, one of the town's well-meaning matchmakers, approached with her usual determined smile. "Margaret, dear, there's someone I'd like you to meet," she said, leading her toward a man who looked less than enthusiastic about the introduction. The conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes. The man, recently divorced, made it clear he was looking for someone who could give him the children his ex-wife wouldn't. When Margaret mentioned she was 42, his smile faded quickly. He excused himself to get another drink and never returned. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She gathered her purse and headed toward the door, trying to leave without drawing attention. But as she walked to her car, she couldn't stop the tears from coming. Another evening. Another reminder that in everyone else's eyes she was somehow not enough. At home in her small apartment above the flower shop, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and curled up with a book. Reading had always been her escape, her way of living 1,000 different lives. Tonight she chose a story about a woman who found love later in life, though she wasn't sure she believed in such fairy tales anymore. She looked around her cozy space, decorated with plants and filled with books. It was a good life, she told herself. She had meaningful work, caring friends, and hobbies she enjoyed. Many people would envy her independence and peaceful routine, but late at night, when the world was quiet, Margaret couldn't ignore the longing in her heart. She wanted someone to share her daily stories with, someone to cook dinner for, someone who would hold her hand during scary movies. Most of all, she dreamed of being part of a family, of having people who needed her as much as she needed them. As she turned off the light, Margaret made the same wish she had made countless times before. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe someday someone would see past her age and recognize the love she had to offer. She drifted off to sleep, not knowing that in just a few weeks her entire world would change in the most unexpected way. The next morning, Margaret woke up with renewed determination. She couldn't control what others thought about her age, but she could control how she spent her days. She would continue being the best librarian she could be, continue caring for her community, and continue believing that somewhere out there, someone was looking for exactly what she had to offer. Little did she know that someone was closer than she ever imagined, and that love would come to her in the most beautiful, unexpected form through the honest words of a child who saw her heart more clearly than any adult ever had. David Chen stared at the pile of laundry on his kitchen table and rubbed his tired eyes. It was nearly midnight, and he still had to pack lunches for tomorrow and sign his daughter's permission slip for the school field trip. 2 years had passed since his wife Amy died, but some days the weight of single parenthood still felt overwhelming. In the living room, he could hear 7-year-old Tommy reading a bedtime story to his younger siblings. Lucy, who was 5, giggled at the funny voices Tommy made for different characters. 3-year-old Sam was probably already asleep, clutching his favorite stuffed elephant. David smiled despite his exhaustion. Tommy had stepped up in ways that broke David's heart. No 7-year-old should have to help raise his little brother and sister, but Tommy did it without complaint. He helped Lucy tie her shoes, reminded Sam to brush his teeth, and even tried to cook scrambled eggs on Saturday mornings. The auto repair shop where David worked was busier than ever, which meant longer hours and more money to support his family, but it also meant less time at home when his children needed him most. Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor, helped with after-school care, but David knew his kids needed more than he could give them right now. Lucy had started having nightmares again, crawling into David's bed in the middle of the night asking for her mama. Sam was having trouble with potty training, something Amy had been working on before she got sick. And Tommy, sweet Tommy, was trying so hard to be the man of the house that David worried he was missing out on just being a kid. David's mother-in-law, Grace, meant well, but her weekly phone calls always left him feeling worse. "Those children need a mother figure," she would say. "You should think about remarrying soon while you're still young enough to find someone good." Grace had even started sending him photos of women from her church back in California. All of them were in their 20s, fresh-faced and eager to start families. David appreciated her concern, but the idea of dating felt impossible. How could he explain to a stranger that Sam still cried for his mama? Or that Lucy needed someone to braid her hair just right? Or that Tommy worried about everything because he remembered watching his mother get sicker and sicker? Amy had been David's high school sweetheart. They had grown up together, learned how to be parents together, and built their life step by step over 15 years of marriage. The thought of starting over with someone new, someone who didn't know his children's favorite songs or their bedtime routines, felt overwhelming. But David couldn't ignore the signs that his family was struggling. Lucy's teacher had gently mentioned that she seemed withdrawn during class activities involving mothers. Sam had started clinging to female cashiers at the grocery store, calling them Mama in his sweet, hopeful voice. Tommy asked fewer questions about his homework, because he had learned that Daddy was always too tired or too busy. Last week, David had attended a parent-teacher conference alone, while watching other couples discuss their children's progress together. He felt like half a person, trying to make decisions that used to be shared between two people who loved these kids more than life itself. The local matchmaker, Mrs. Patterson, had approached David at the post office just yesterday. She spoke in hushed tones about suitable young ladies who would be perfect for a man in your situation. She emphasized how important it was for the children to have a proper mother who could give them the stability they deserved. David knew she meant well, but her words made him feel like he was failing his children. Was he being selfish by not actively looking for a wife? Were his kids suffering because he couldn't bring himself to date? The guilt was eating away at him. At work, his buddy Mike constantly encouraged him to get back out there. Mike had been divorced for 3 years and seemed to enjoy his bachelor lifestyle. But Mike didn't have 3 young children depending on him for everything from morning hugs to help with bad dreams. David had tried to imagine what it would be like to bring someone new into their lives. Would his children accept a stepmother? Would a new wife understand that Tommy still slept with Amy's old scarf? Or that Lucy needed exactly 4 books read to her each night? Would she be patient with Sam's tendency to hide under tables when he felt overwhelmed? The practical concerns were just as daunting. David's house still had family photos everywhere. Amy's clothes still hung in the closet and her coffee mug still sat in the kitchen cabinet. He couldn't imagine asking someone to move into a space that still belonged so completely to his late wife. But late at night, when the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, David felt the loneliness settle around him like a heavy blanket. He missed having someone to talk to about his day, someone to help make decisions about the kids, someone to share both the worries and the joys of watching them grow. He missed the way Amy used to listen to Tommy practice reading, celebrating each new word like it was a miracle. He missed how she would dance around the kitchen with Lucy, making ordinary Wednesday afternoons feel magical. He missed having someone who understood that Sam's stubborn streak came from love, not defiance. Most of all, David missed seeing his children experience the kind of unconditional love that only a mother could provide. He loved them fiercely, but he knew they were missing something essential. They needed someone who could see them through gentle eyes, someone who had the patience to answer the same questions over and over, someone who could kiss away their hurts and celebrate their smallest victories. As David finally folded the last load of laundry, he made a silent promise to his children. Somehow, some way, he would find a way to give them what they needed. He didn't know how or when, but he would keep trying to be both mother and father until the right person came into their lives. Tommy Chen sat on the front porch steps, tears streaming down his cheeks as he held a small shoebox in his lap. Inside was Whiskers, his beloved pet hamster who had died that morning. The little boy had found him curled up in his cage, peaceful but still, and Tommy's world had felt like it was crashing down around him. David knelt beside his son, feeling helpless. Tommy had loved that hamster more than any toy or game. Whiskers had been a gift for Tommy's 6th birthday, back when Amy was still alive and their family felt complete. Now losing his pet felt like losing another piece of the happiness Tommy remembered from before. "Can we bury him in the backyard, Daddy?" Tommy asked through his tears. "Next to Mama's rosebush?" David's heart clenched. Amy had planted that rosebush the year before she died, and it had become their special place to remember her. "Of course, buddy," he said softly. "But first maybe we should do something special to remember Whiskers. Would you like that?" Tommy nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. David remembered hearing about something at the library, some kind of memorial corner where people could honor their pets. It seemed like exactly what Tommy needed right now. The library was quiet when they arrived, with just a few people browsing the shelves. Margaret looked up from her desk when she heard the bell above the door chime. She immediately noticed the little boy with red puffy eyes carrying a small box, followed by a worried-looking father. "Excuse me," David said, approaching her desk hesitantly. "I heard you have something here for pets who have died? My son's hamster passed away this morning and he's having a really hard time." Margaret's heart went out to them instantly. She had created the Pet Memorial Corner 6 months ago, after several families in town had lost beloved animals. It was a quiet space with comfortable cushions, memory books, and gentle stories about the love between people and their pets. "Of course," Margaret said gently, coming around from behind her desk. She knelt down to Tommy's level, speaking in the soft voice she used with all the children who visited her library. "I'm so sorry about your hamster. Would you like to tell me about him?" Tommy looked up at her with swimming eyes. His name was Whiskers, and he loved sunflower seeds. He would stuff them in his cheeks until they looked like balloons. Despite his sadness, Tommy almost smiled at the memory. Margaret led them to the memorial corner, a cozy nook she had decorated with soft lighting and peaceful artwork. She had several blank memory books on a small shelf, along with colored pencils, stickers, and other supplies for creating tributes. "Would you like to make a memory book for Whiskers?" Margaret asked. "We can draw pictures of him and write down all the things that made him special." For the next hour, Margaret sat with Tommy on the floor cushions, helping him create a beautiful tribute to his pet. She listened patiently as he told her stories about Whiskers' funny habits, like how he would run on his wheel at exactly bedtime every night, or how he would hide treats under his bedding for later. David watched from a nearby chair, amazed by the transformation in his son. Margaret had a natural way with children that reminded him painfully of Amy. She didn't rush Tommy or try to make him feel better with empty words. Instead, she honored his grief and helped him celebrate the love he had shared with his pet. "My mama used to say that love never really dies," Tommy told Margaret as he colored a picture of Whiskers eating a sunflower seed. "She said it just moves into our hearts and stays there forever." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Your mama sounds like she was a very wise woman," she said softly. "And I think she's right. The love you had for Whiskers will always be with you, even though you can't see him anymore." Tommy nodded seriously. "Do you think Whiskers is with my mama now? Taking care of each other?" Margaret glanced at David, who nodded slightly, his own eyes wet with emotion. "I think that's a beautiful way to imagine it," she said. "I bet your mama was so happy to meet the special hamster who made her little boy smile." As they worked together, Margaret shared stories from books about the cycle of life in nature. She showed Tommy pictures of how flowers grow from seeds, how caterpillars become butterflies, and how every living thing has its own special journey. She made death seem less scary and more like a natural part of the story of life. Tommy's tears gradually stopped as he focused on his memory book. He drew pictures of Whiskers in his favorite spots around the house, wrote down his favorite memories, and even included a poem about hamsters that Margaret helped him compose. David found himself studying this gentle librarian who had somehow worked magic with his grieving son. She was probably in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair that she wore in a simple ponytail. She wasn't what most people would call glamorous, but there was something beautiful about the way she gave Tommy her complete attention. When Tommy finished his memory book, Margaret helped him place it on the special memorial shelf alongside tributes other families had created for their pets. Whisker's story will stay here, she explained, so other children who are sad about their pets can read about him and know they're not alone in their feelings. Tommy beamed with pride. Really, other kids will know about Whiskers? Absolutely, Margaret smiled. And if you ever want to come back and read his story or add new memories, you're always welcome here. As they prepared to leave, Tommy tugged on Margaret's sleeve. Thank you for helping me remember Whiskers the right way, he said. Will you help me pick out books about hamsters when I'm ready for a new pet? I would love to help you with that, Margaret replied warmly. That sounds like a wonderful way to honor Whiskers' memory. David shook Margaret's hand at the door. Thank you, he said simply, but his voice carried deep gratitude. I haven't seen him smile like that in weeks. As they walked to the car, Tommy chattered excitedly about the memorial corner and all the books Margaret had shown him. For the first time since Whiskers died, he seemed like himself again. David glanced back at the library, where Margaret was still visible through the window, reshelved books with the same gentle care she had shown his son. Something about her kindness had touched not just Tommy, but something deep in David's own heart that he thought had been buried with Amy. 2 weeks after the hamster incident, David found himself making excuses to visit the library. First, it was to return a book about car maintenance that he claimed to need for work. Then it was to help Tommy research different types of hamsters, since he had decided he wanted to get another pet eventually. Margaret welcomed them each time with the same warm smile that had comforted Tommy on that difficult day. She never seemed rushed or annoyed by their frequent visits, even though David suspected she knew his reasons for coming weren't entirely about books. Lucy, David's 5-year-old daughter, had started asking to come along on these library trips. She was a shy child who still missed her mother deeply, but something about Margaret made her feel safe. Margaret had a special way of reading picture books, using different voices for each character, and making sound effects that had Lucy giggling within minutes. Miss Margaret, will you read the one about the brave princess again? Lucy would ask, climbing onto the reading chair beside her. Margaret always said yes, no matter how many times Lucy requested the same story. 3-year-old Sam was the biggest surprise. The toddler who usually clung to David's leg around strangers took to Margaret immediately. Maybe it was because she got down on the floor to play with him, or because she kept a special box of large, colorful alphabet blocks just for little hands like his. Look, Miss Margaret, Sam would shout proudly when he successfully stacked 3 blocks in a row. Margaret always celebrated his achievements as if he had just solved the most complicated puzzle in the world. David watched these interactions with growing amazement. His children, who had been cautious around new adults since their mother's death, seemed to bloom in Margaret's presence. Tommy helped her organize books by size. Lucy practiced reading simple words aloud without fear of making mistakes. And Sam learned to sit quietly during story time instead of running around the library. Margaret, for her part, found herself looking forward to their visits more than she cared to admit. The children brought light and energy into her quiet library in ways that made her heart feel full. Tommy's thoughtful questions about books reminded her why she loved being a librarian. Lucy's sweet giggle during story time was the best sound she had heard in years. And Sam's innocent trust touched something deep in her maternal instincts that she had thought would never be fulfilled. More importantly, she began to notice David himself. He was patient with his children, always listening to their concerns and treating their problems as important no matter how small. He worked hard to provide for them, but never seemed too busy to give them hugs or help with their questions. One afternoon, while the children were absorbed in a puppet show Margaret had set up, David lingered near the checkout desk. "They really love coming here," he said, watching Tommy help Lucy choose a book. "I can't remember the last time I've seen them this happy." "They're wonderful children," Margaret replied honestly. "You're doing an amazing job with them." David's smile was tinged with sadness. "Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water. There's so much I don't know about raising kids, especially without—" He trailed off, but Margaret understood. "Parenting is hard even with two people," she said gently. "The fact that they're so kind and caring shows how much love you give them." Their conversations began to extend beyond the children. David learned that Margaret had grown up in a big family, but had never married or had children of her own. Margaret discovered that David had been a teenage father who grew up alongside his kids, learning responsibility and love in ways that shaped him into the thoughtful man he was today. Margaret started staying late on the days she knew they were coming, preparing special activities for the children or finding new books she thought they would enjoy. She created a small reading corner just for them, with cushions in their favorite colors and a basket of books selected especially for their reading levels. The children began talking about Margaret at home constantly. "Miss Margaret showed me how to sound out big words," Tommy would tell his father at dinner. "Miss Margaret says I'm getting really good at using my imagination," Lucy would announce proudly. "Miss Margaret played blocks with me for a whole hour," Sam would exclaim, as if it was the most wonderful thing that had ever happened. David found himself sharing stories about his children with Margaret, telling her about Tommy's love of science experiments or Lucy's dream of becoming a veterinarian. Margaret listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions and remembering details from their previous conversations. One evening, when David came to pick up the children after work, he found them helping Margaret close up the library. Tommy was putting books back on shelves, Lucy was organizing the puppet theater, and Sam was carefully placing the alphabet blocks in their storage bin. "They insisted on helping," Margaret explained with a smile. "I think they like feeling useful." David watched his children working alongside Margaret with a sense of belonging he hadn't seen since Amy's death. They looked like a family, he realized with surprise. Not the broken, struggling unit he sometimes felt they were, but a complete, happy family. As they walked to the car that night, Lucy slipped her small hand into David's. "Daddy," she said in her serious 5-year-old voice, "I think Miss Margaret is lonely like we are sometimes." David looked down at his perceptive daughter. "What makes you think that?" "She doesn't have any kids to read stories to at her house," Lucy explained. "And she always looks a little sad when we have to leave." Tommy, overhearing the conversation, nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we could invite her for dinner sometime? She helped me when Whiskers died, and now she helps us with books. Maybe we could help her with something too." David's heart swelled with pride at his children's empathy, but he also felt a flutter of something that had been dormant for 2 years. The idea of Margaret joining them for dinner felt right in a way that surprised him. Not as a replacement for Amy, but as someone who could become part of their story moving forward. That night, as David tucked his children into bed, he realized that for the first time since Amy's death, his house felt alive again. The children were laughing more, asking fewer worried questions, and seemed to have rediscovered their natural curiosity about the world. And if David was honest with himself, he was changing too. Margaret's gentle wisdom and genuine care for his children had awakened feelings he thought were buried forever. Not the desperate love of his youth, but something deeper and steadier built on mutual respect, shared values, and the beautiful way she had become part of their daily lives without even trying. The whispers started small, like they always do in small towns. Mrs. Henderson noticed David's truck parked outside the library more often than seemed necessary for book borrowing. Mrs. Patterson observed, Margaret staying late on certain evenings long after her usual closing time. The town's informal network of gossipers began connecting the dots. "It's sweet that she's helping with the children," Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned to her sister over coffee. "But people are starting to talk." The first direct comment came at the grocery store. David was shopping with all 3 kids when he ran into Jake, an old high school friend. The children were excitedly telling Jake about the puppet show Margaret had organized when Jake pulled David aside. "Listen, buddy," Jake said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I'm only telling you this because I care about you and the kids. People are starting to say things about you and the librarian. David felt his stomach tighten. What kind of things? Just that maybe you're not thinking clearly, Jake said uncomfortably. You know, grief can make a man make decisions he wouldn't normally make. Margaret's a nice lady, but she's not exactly what most guys your age would go for, if you know what I mean. David's face flushed with anger. But before he could respond, Tommy tugged on his sleeve asking about cereal choices. Jake patted David's shoulder and walked away, leaving David standing in aisle 7 feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. The comments became more frequent and less subtle. At Tommy's school pickup, other parents would give David sympathetic looks and make pointed comments about moving on in healthy ways and thinking about what's best for the children's future. Margaret began noticing changes, too. The friendly nods from neighbors became awkward glances. Mrs. Patterson, who used to chat with her about community events, now seemed too busy for conversation whenever their paths crossed. The breaking point came during the monthly town council meeting that Margaret always attended as the library representative. She was presenting her request for new children's books when she overheard a conversation in the back row. "It's just not appropriate," one woman whispered to another. "She's taking advantage of that poor widowed man's vulnerability. And those children need a proper mother figure," the other replied. "Someone young enough to keep up with them, someone who could give them siblings." Margaret's presentation faltered as the words hit her like physical blows. She had heard similar things before about her age, but never in connection with David and his children. Never about a relationship that had brought her more joy than she had ever imagined possible. After the meeting, Margaret sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to compose herself. She thought about the previous afternoon when Lucy had fallen asleep in her lap during story time, how natural and right it had felt to stroke the little girl's hair. She thought about Tommy's proud smile when he successfully read a difficult book, and Sam's infectious giggles during their games with alphabet blocks. Was she really being selfish? Were her feelings for David and his children causing them harm in the community they had to live in? David was facing similar pressure from multiple directions. His mother-in-law Grace called more frequently, her voice tight with disapproval. "David, honey, I understand you're lonely," Grace said during one particularly difficult conversation. "But you have to think about what Amy would want for those babies. She'd want them to have a young, energetic mother who could give them the kind of life they deserve." Grace had even gone so far as to send photos of her neighbor's daughter, a 26-year-old nurse who had expressed interest in meeting David. "She's perfect for you," Grace insisted. "Young enough to have more children, established in her career, and she specifically said she loves the idea of being a stepmother." At work, David's colleagues weren't much better. Mike continued his campaign to get David back into the dating scene, but his suggestions always involved women barely out of college. "Come on, man," Mike would say during lunch breaks. "You're still young. You could start completely fresh with someone who doesn't come with all the baggage of being an old maid." David had snapped at Mike after that comment, telling him never to speak about Margaret that way again. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. The worst moment came when David overheard two mothers talking at Lucy's dance class. "It's so sad," one was saying. "Those poor children are getting attached to someone who's clearly just using them to feel maternal. What happens when she realizes she's too old for this kind of life? And what about David?" The other replied. "He's settling for the first woman who paid attention to his kids. He could do so much better if he just tried." David felt sick to his stomach. Were these people right? Was he being unfair to his children by allowing them to get attached to Margaret? Was he being unfair to Margaret by letting her invest her time and emotions in a situation that the whole town seemed to think was doomed? That evening, David found himself questioning everything. He watched Margaret reading to his children, saw the love and patience in her interactions with them, and felt torn between his heart and the voices of his community. Margaret sensed the change in David's behavior immediately. He seemed distracted during their conversations, less inclined to linger after picking up the children. The easy comfort they had developed felt strained and awkward. One evening, after the children had reluctantly left with their father, Margaret sat alone in the library and faced the painful truth. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was too old, too set in her ways, too different from what David and his children really needed. She thought about the young teacher, Jenny, who had caught Tom's attention at the social gathering. Jenny was lovely, energetic, and probably dreamed of having children of her own someday. Wouldn't that be better for Tommy, Lucy, and Sam? Wouldn't they be better off with someone who could grow with them instead of someone who was already middle-aged? Margaret's sister Linda called that night as if sensing her distress. "How are things going with your widower and his children?" Linda asked cheerfully. Margaret found herself crying as she explained the situation. "Maybe I'm fooling myself," she sobbed. "Maybe I'm just a lonely woman who's gotten too attached to the first family that showed me kindness." "Margaret Chen," Linda said firmly, using their childhood nickname for serious conversations. "Don't you dare let small-minded people make you doubt something beautiful. I've never heard you sound as happy as you have these past few months, but the damage was done." Both David and Margaret began pulling back from their growing connection, each convinced they were protecting the other from making a mistake that would hurt them all in the long run. Neither realized that the children were watching this withdrawal with confusion and growing sadness, wondering what they had done wrong to make the adults in their lives suddenly seem so distant and worried. The annual Harvest Festival was the biggest event in town, and this year it felt like a setup. David arrived with his 3 children, immediately noticing how many people seemed eager to introduce him to eligible young women. Mrs. Patterson appeared within minutes, practically dragging him toward a group that included Jenny, the teacher, and 2 other women in their 20s. "David," Mrs. Patterson exclaimed loudly enough for half the festival to hear. "I want you to meet Ashley. She's new in town, works as a pediatric nurse, and she absolutely loves children." Ashley was undeniably attractive, with bright eyes and an energetic smile. She immediately knelt down to the children's level, introducing herself with the kind of enthusiasm that should have impressed David. Instead, he found himself comparing her forced cheerfulness to Margaret's natural warmth. "Your daddy tells me you love books," Ashley said to Tommy, though David hadn't mentioned anything about books. "I love reading too. Maybe we could read together sometime." Tommy smiled politely but moved closer to his father's side. Lucy, always the shy one, half hid behind David's legs. Only Sam seemed interested, mainly because Ashley was wearing colorful hair clips that caught his attention. Throughout the afternoon, David felt like he was being paraded around like a prize at auction. Every conversation seemed to steer toward his availability and how ready he must be to move on with his life. The women were all perfectly nice, but their interest felt calculated, as if they saw him as a package deal rather than a person. Margaret had come to the festival alone, as she did every year. She helped with the library's book sale booth, trying to ignore the pointed looks and whispered conversations that seemed to follow her. She watched from across the festival grounds as David was surrounded by admirers, and her heart sank. This was what he needed, she told herself. These young, vibrant women who could give him and his children everything she couldn't. She was about to pack up early and go home when she heard a commotion near the playground. Sam had been playing on the swings when he spotted Margaret across the crowd. Without warning, he jumped off the swing and ran straight toward her, weaving between people with the fearless confidence of a 3-year-old. "Miss Margaret! Miss Margaret!" he shouted, throwing himself into her arms with such force that she nearly toppled over. David looked up from his conversation with Ashley to see his youngest son wrapped around Margaret like she was a life preserver. His heart clenched as he watched Margaret's face light up with pure joy, the sadness that had been there all afternoon melting away. Tommy, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with all the attention from strangers, saw his brothers escape and made his own break for freedom. He grabbed Lucy's hand and led her through the crowd toward Margaret, leaving Ashley mid-sentence about her love of outdoor activities. "We found you," Lucy exclaimed, hugging Margaret's waist. "Daddy's been talking to lots of people, but we wanted to find you." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the children's affection, especially knowing that half the town was probably watching this reunion. She glanced around nervously, seeing the disapproving faces of some community members and the calculating expressions of others. "Maybe you should go back to your daddy," Margaret said gently, though it broke her heart to suggest it. "He's meeting some very nice ladies." Tommy, wise beyond his 7 years, looked directly into Margaret's eyes. "We don't want to meet nice ladies," he said firmly. "We want to be with you." David finally extracted himself from the crowd and approached them, feeling the eyes of the entire festival on this little scene. Ashley and several other women followed, clearly expecting him to collect his children and return to their conversations. "Kids, you can't just run off like that," David said, but his voice lacked any real scolding. Seeing his children's happiness with Margaret after an afternoon of watching them politely endure strangers' attention made his heart ache. "Daddy," Lucy said in her serious little voice, "can Miss Margaret come have dinner with us? She looks sad, and we know how to make her happy." The simple honesty of the request hung in the air. David looked at Margaret's face, seeing the hope and fear battling in her expressions. He looked at his children, who were practically vibrating with excitement at the possibility. Then he looked around at the crowd of onlookers, some supportive, some clearly disapproving. For a moment, David felt paralyzed by the weight of everyone's expectations. The appropriate choice would be to politely decline, to take his children back to the group of young women who represented his future. The safe choice would be to avoid becoming the subject of even more gossip. Instead, David found himself remembering the past few months. He thought about Tommy's genuine laughter during story time, Lucy's confidence when Margaret helped her read, Sam's absolute trust as he fell asleep in Margaret's arms during long library visits. He thought about his own feelings of peace and rightness when they were all together. "You know what?" David said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "That sounds like a perfect idea." Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. "David, you don't have to." "I want to," he said firmly, then looked around at the crowd. "We all want to." Ashley stepped forward with a tight smile. "Well, maybe another time then," she said. But her tone suggested there wouldn't be another time. Mrs. Patterson looked like she had swallowed something sour. "David, dear, don't you think—" "I think," David interrupted, "that my children are the best judges of who makes them happy. And right now, that's Miss Margaret." Tommy beamed with pride at his father's words. Lucy clapped her hands together excitedly. Sam bounced on his toes and reached for both David's and Margaret's hands. "Can we go now?" Sam asked loudly. "I want to show Miss Margaret my new dinosaur book." As they walked away from the festival together, David felt lighter than he had in weeks. Behind them, he could hear the buzz of conversation starting up again, but for the first time he didn't care what people were saying. Margaret walked beside them, still stunned by David's public declaration. The man who had been avoiding eye contact with her for days had just chosen her over a crowd of younger, more suitable options. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly as the children ran ahead toward David's truck. David stopped walking and turned to face her completely. "Margaret," he said, "the only thing I'm sure about anymore is that my children love you, and that makes me—" He paused, searching for the right words. "That makes me want to see where this leads." As they drove toward David's house, the children chattered excitedly in the back seat about what they would make for dinner and which books they would show Margaret. For the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, age was just a number when love was real. That evening at David's house felt like magic. Margaret helped the children make pancakes for dinner, something Amy used to do when they wanted breakfast foods at the wrong time of day. The kitchen filled with laughter as Sam tried to flip a pancake and ended up wearing half of it, while Lucy carefully arranged berries into smiley faces on her plate. Tommy, usually the serious one, told joke after joke from a book he had borrowed from the library. Even his bad puns had everyone giggling, and Margaret realized this was the first time she had seen David truly relaxed in weeks. After dinner, they all piled onto the couch to watch a family movie. Sam curled up in Margaret's lap, his head heavy against her chest as he fought sleep. Lucy snuggled into her other side, occasionally whispering questions about the movie characters. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, leaning back against Margaret's legs. David watched this scene from his chair, feeling a profound sense of rightness wash over him. This was what home was supposed to feel like. Not the frantic rushing of daily survival, but this peaceful contentment that came from being surrounded by people who genuinely cared for each other. When it was time for Margaret to leave, the children's protests were loud and heartfelt. "Can't Miss Margaret just sleep on the couch?" Tommy suggested hopefully. "She could use my pillow," Lucy offered generously. "No leave," Sam mumbled sleepily, tightening his arms around Margaret's neck. David finally convinced them to let Margaret go home, but only after promising that she would come back soon. As he walked her to her car, the autumn air crisp around them, Both adults felt the weight of unspoken feelings. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "Tonight felt like family," David finished, the words coming out before he could stop them. Margaret nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "I should go before I say something that makes this complicated." But David reached out and gently touched her arm. What if complicated isn't necessarily bad? They stood in the driveway for a long moment, the space between them charged with possibility. Finally, Margaret got in her car, but both of them knew something fundamental had shifted that evening. David couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about how natural everything had felt, how his children had bloomed in Margaret's presence, how he himself had felt more like the man he wanted to be when she was there. Around 2 a.m, he made a decision that surprised even him. The next morning was Saturday, which meant no work and no school. David got up early and gathered his children around the kitchen table while they ate their cereal. "Kids, I want to talk to you about something important," he began, his heart racing with nervous excitement. 3 pairs of eyes looked at him expectantly. "How would you feel if Miss Margaret became part of our family? I mean, really part of our family?" Tommy's spoon clattered into his bowl. "Like forever part? Like she would live here with us?" Lucy asked, her voice rising with hope. "Like a mama?" Sam added, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was asking. David nodded slowly. "Exactly like that. But I need to know if that's what you really want. Because once we ask her, we can't take it back." The children's response was immediate and unanimous. Tommy started bouncing in his chair. Lucy clapped her hands and squealed, and Sam began chanting, "Miss Margaret, Mama. Miss Margaret, Mama," at the top of his lungs. "But Daddy," Tommy said suddenly, his expression growing serious, "what if she says no? What if she doesn't want to be our mama?" David's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his son's voice. "That's a risk we'll have to take, buddy. Sometimes the most important things in life require us to be brave." "Will you ask her today?" Lucy demanded, practically vibrating with excitement. "Actually," David said, grinning at their enthusiasm, "I was hoping you 3 would help me ask her." The next hour was spent in frantic preparation. The children insisted on making construction paper flowers because real flowers die, but these ones last forever, just like love. Tommy wrote out a speech on notebook paper, practicing his words until he had them memorized. Lucy picked out her fanciest dress and insisted that Sam wear his button-up shirt. David showered and put on the nice sweater Margaret had once complimented. They arrived at the library just as Margaret was opening for the day. She looked surprised to see them so early, especially dressed up and carrying a bouquet of colorful paper flowers. "This is quite the welcoming committee," Margaret said with a smile, though she noticed David looked unusually nervous. "Miss Margaret," Tommy began, his voice shaking slightly with excitement, "we have something very important to ask you." Margaret's heart began to race, though she tried to tell herself not to read too much into a 7-year-old's dramatics. "We talked about it as a family," Lucy added, stepping forward with her share of the paper flowers. "And we all agree," Sam announced proudly, though he had clearly been coached on these words. David took a deep breath and, to Margaret's complete shock, dropped to one knee right there in the library entrance. Several early morning patrons stopped what they were doing to stare, but David only had eyes for Margaret. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "these past few months, you've given my children something I thought they'd lost forever. You've given them joy, patience, unconditional love, and a sense of security that I couldn't provide on my own." Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, tears already starting to fall. "But more than that," David continued, "you've given me hope. Hope that love doesn't only happen once in a lifetime. Hope that families can grow and change and still be beautiful. Hope that age is just a number when hearts connect the way ours have." Tommy stepped forward and handed Margaret his paper flowers. "Miss Margaret, will you marry our daddy and be our mama forever?" "We promise to be good," Lucy added earnestly. "And we'll help you learn all our favorite things." "And I'll share my dinosaurs," Sam announced solemnly, as if offering his most precious possessions. Margaret looked down at their expectant faces, then at David's hopeful expression, and felt her heart explode with joy. This wasn't how she had ever imagined love would find her. Not through online dating or introductions at social gatherings, but through the honest need of 3 children who had chosen her as much as she had chosen them. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, yes, of course, yes." The children erupted in cheers. Tommy threw his arms around her waist. Lucy began jumping up and down, and Sam started his happy chant of, "Miss Margaret, Mama." All over again. David stood and pulled Margaret into his arms, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. Around them, the library patrons who had witnessed the proposal burst into spontaneous applause. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked through her tears. "Really, truly sure? Because once I love you all, I'm never letting go." "We're counting on it," David said, kissing her forehead gently. "We've been waiting our whole lives for you, Margaret. We just didn't know it until now." As news of the proposal spread through the small town that day, reactions were mixed. But for the first time in months, neither David nor Margaret cared what anyone else thought. They had found their family in the most unexpected way, and love that real couldn't be diminished by anyone else's opinions. 6 months later, the same community center that had once made Margaret feel invisible was decorated with simple white flowers and filled with people celebrating love in its most beautiful form. Margaret stood in the small bridal room, smoothing down her simple ivory dress and trying to calm her nervous excitement. Her sister Linda had flown in from the city and was bustling around making final adjustments to Margaret's hair and makeup. "I still can't believe this is happening," Linda said with tears in her eyes. "When you called to tell me about the proposal, I cried for an hour." Margaret smiled at her reflection, hardly recognizing the radiant woman looking back at her. At 43, she was finally becoming a bride, but more importantly, she was becoming a mother to 3 children who had chosen her as much as she had chosen them. "Are you ready for this?" Linda asked softly. "It's a big step, taking on 3 kids and a husband all at once." "I've been ready my whole life," Margaret replied without hesitation. "I just didn't know this was how it would happen." In the main hall, David stood at the altar wearing his best suit, his hands shaking slightly with nervous energy. His 3 children stood beside him as his wedding party, dressed in their finest clothes and beaming with pride. Tommy, now 8 years old, held the rings in a small pillow Margaret had made herself. He had grown so much in the past months, his confidence blooming under Margaret's patient encouragement. Just yesterday, he had told David, "I can't remember what it felt like before Miss Margaret was part of our family." Lucy, 6 now and more outgoing than she had been in years, wore a pale yellow dress and carried a small bouquet of real flowers to match Margaret's paper ones from the proposal. She had spent weeks practicing walking slowly down the aisle, determined to do her part perfectly. 3-year-old Sam, nearly 4 now, wore a tiny bow tie and had the important job of carrying the rings back up, plastic toy rings just in case he dropped the real ones. He kept whispering loudly to anyone who would listen, "Today Miss Margaret becomes Mama Margaret." The community center was full, but not everyone there had been initially supportive. Over the months between the engagement and the wedding, opinions had slowly begun to shift. People witnessed how the Chen children had flourished, how David had become more confident and happy, and how Margaret had brought stability and joy to a family that desperately needed both. Mrs. Rodriguez, their helpful neighbor, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the family at the altar. She had seen the transformation in those children firsthand, and knew that love like this was rare and precious. Even Mrs. Patterson, the town matchmaker who had initially disapproved, sat in the 3rd row with a genuine smile on her face. She had been forced to admit that her perfect matches paled in comparison to the real thing when she watched Margaret help Lucy through a difficult bout with the flu, staying up all night to make sure the little girl felt safe and cared for. The music began, and Margaret appeared at the back of the hall. She walked alone, having chosen to give herself away to this new family rather than being given by anyone else. But as she made her way down the aisle, she didn't feel alone at all. Her eyes met David's, and she saw in them the same wonder and gratitude that filled her own heart. Then she looked at the children, her children, who were practically bouncing with excitement as she approached. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. David and Margaret exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising not just to love each other, but to build a family based on kindness, patience, and unconditional acceptance. But the most touching moment came when Margaret knelt down to the children's level and made special vows to each of them. "Tommy," she said, taking his hands in hers, "I promise to always listen to your questions and help you find the answers. I promise to celebrate your curiosity and support your dreams, no matter how big they are." Tommy's eyes filled with tears as he whispered, "I promise to help you learn how to be our mama." Lucy, Margaret continued, turning to the little girl, I promise to read you as many stories as you want, to braid your hair when you ask, and to always believe in your strength and intelligence. Lucy threw her arms around Margaret's neck. I promise to teach you my favorite games and share my toys with you. Finally, Margaret looked at Sam, who was trying very hard to stand still despite his excitement. Sam, I promise to play with you, to help you learn new things and to give you hugs whenever you need them. Sam's response was typically direct. I promise to love you forever and ever, Mama Margaret. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. When the minister pronounced them a family, Tommy stepped forward with a speech he had insisted on giving. My Mama Amy is in heaven, he said in his clear, confident voice. And I know she's happy that Miss Margaret is taking care of us now. Love doesn't run out when you share it. It just gets bigger. The applause that followed was thunderous, and Margaret realized that Tommy had just said what many people in their small town had needed to hear. This wasn't about replacing anyone or settling for less. This was about love multiplying and families growing in unexpected ways. The reception was filled with dancing, laughter, and speeches from friends and family who had witnessed their journey. David's mother-in-law, Grace, who had flown in from California, approached Margaret during the cake cutting. I owe you an apology, Grace said quietly. I thought those babies needed someone younger, someone who could start fresh with David. I was wrong. They needed someone who could love them exactly as they are, and that someone was you. Margaret hugged her new extended family member warmly. They're easy to love, she said simply. As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself surrounded by the 3 children, all of them tired but happy. Sam had fallen asleep in her arms. Lucy was leaning against her side, and Tommy was telling her about all the adventures they would have as a real family. David approached them with a soft smile. Ready to go home, Mrs. Chen? Margaret's heart swelled at the sound of her new name. Home, she repeated wonderfully. I love the sound of that. As they loaded the sleepy children into the car, Margaret reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them together. A year ago, she had been the overlooked woman sitting alone at community gatherings. Tonight she was surrounded by people who loved her not despite her age, but because of everything that age had taught her about patience, kindness, and the true meaning of family. The drive home was quiet, with all 3 children asleep in the back seat. David reached over and took Margaret's hand. No regrets? He asked softly. Margaret looked back at the sleeping faces of her children, then at the man who had been brave enough to choose love over convention. The only regret I have, she said with a smile, is that it took us so long to find each other. As they pulled into the driveway of what was now Margaret's home too, she realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories don't begin with young hearts and perfect timing. Sometimes they begin with patient hearts and perfect love, no matter what age it arrives. The house that had once echoed with the sadness of loss now rang with the joy of new beginnings. And in the years that followed, whenever people in town spoke of the Chen family, they spoke of them as proof that love really can conquer all, especially when it arrives in the most unexpected and beautiful ways.